Hey there. Couldn't sleep? It's okay, you're in the right place, just a small favor. Did you know 89% watch without subscribing? If you enjoy this, I'd really appreciate your support. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Thanks for being here. My name is Jack Holloway, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest mysteries lie in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to discover. It all started back in the summer of 2019. I was 28, fresh out of a soul-crushing job in finance and desperate for something, anything, that didn't involve staring at spreadsheets until my eyes bled. So I did what any self-respecting millennial with savings and an existential crisis would do. I bought a beat-up RV and hit the road. For 3 months I crisscrossed the country, chasing sunsets and fleeing my own restlessness. I'd seen the neon glow of Vegas, the stark beauty of the Mojave, and the rolling hills of the Appalachians. But it wasn't until I reached Evergreen Heights National Park in Montana that I felt something shift inside me. Evergreen Heights wasn't as famous as some of its national park siblings, but that was part of its charm. As I pulled into the visitor center parking lot, I was struck by the sheer majesty of the place. Jagged peaks pierced the sky, their snow-capped summits hidden behind wisps of cloud. Dense forests of pine and fir blanketed the lower slopes, a sea of green that seemed to stretch on forever. I'd never been much of an outdoorsman. Growing up in Chicago, my idea of wilderness was the overgrown lot behind my apartment building. But something about Evergreen Heights called to me. Maybe it was the crisp mountain air, so different from the city smog I was used to. Or perhaps it was the promise of solitude, a chance to be truly alone with my thoughts for the first time in years. Whatever the reason, I found myself at the campground office booking a spot for my RV. The ranger on duty, a weathered man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, eyed me skeptically as I filled out the paperwork. "First time camping?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, feeling a bit sheepish. "That obvious, huh?" He chuckled. "You've got that look about you. City boy, right?" "Born and raised in Chicago," I admitted. The ranger, his name tag read Frank, leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Listen, son, Evergreen Heights isn't Disneyland. We've got bears, mountain lions, and all sorts of critters that won't think twice about making you their dinner if you're not careful. You sure you want to do this?" For a moment, doubt crept in. What was I thinking, trying to play outdoorsman in a place like this? But then I remembered the suffocating feel of my cubicle, the endless parade of meetings and reports. No, I needed this. "I'm sure," I said, squaring my shoulders. "I'll be careful, I promise." Frank nodded, seemingly satisfied. "All right then, stick to the marked trails. Keep your food locked up tight, and for God's sake, don't try to pet any wildlife, no matter how cute they look. You run into any trouble, you give us a holler on the emergency radio. Got it?" I left the office with a map, a bear whistle, and a healthy dose of trepidation. As I drove my RV to the assigned campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. But there was excitement too, a thrill of anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. My campsite was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As I fumbled my way through setting up camp, I struck up a conversation with my neighbors, a retired couple named Tom and Linda. They were seasoned campers, full of advice and warnings about the park. "You've got to see Obsidian Lake," Linda gushed, her eyes lighting up. "It's about a 2-hour hike from here, but it's absolutely breathtaking. Just be sure to start early and bring plenty of water." Tom nodded in agreement. "And keep an eye out for the wildlife. We saw a black bear just yesterday, not far from here." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campground, I retreated to my RV. The excitement of the day gave way to a creeping unease as darkness fell. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. I woke with the dawn, groggy and disoriented. As I stumbled out of the RV, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I noticed something odd. A battered pickup truck was parked near the campground entrance, its faded blue paint covered in a layer of dust and mud. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. As I watched, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the outdoors. His clothes were worn and dirty, as if he'd been living rough for some time. Our eyes met for a brief moment and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in his gaze, a wildness that set my nerves on edge. The man turned away, disappearing into the trees without a word. I stood there for a long moment, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just another camper, albeit an odd one. Determined to put the strange man out of my mind, I decided to take Linda's advice and hike to Obsidian Lake. I packed a day bag with water, snacks, and the bear whistle, double-checking the map before setting out. The trail started easily enough, a well-worn path winding through the forest. The morning air was crisp and invigorating, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. As I walked, the tension of the night before began to melt away. This was why I'd come here, I realized, to experience this sense of freedom, of being a small part of something vast and ancient. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. A flash of bright orange caught my eye, standing out starkly against the green and brown of the forest. As I drew closer, I saw that it was a strip of surveyor's tape tied around a tree trunk. Curious, I looked around and spotted another piece of tape further up the trail, and another beyond that. They seemed to be marking some kind of path, veering off from the main trail and deeper into the woods. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. The ranger's warnings echoed in my mind, urging me to stick to the marked trails. But something about those orange markers called to me, hinting at mystery and adventure. Against my better judgment, I left the main trail, following the line of surveyor's tape into the unknown. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker. I had to push my way through in places, the branches scratching at my arms and face. After about 20 minutes of tough going, I emerged into a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The ground had been cleared in a rough circle, the earth packed down as if by repeated foot traffic. In the center stood a crude structure, little more than a lean-to made of branches and tarpaulin. But it was what surrounded the structure that truly chilled me. Hanging from the trees, swaying gently in the breeze, were dozens of small objects. As I drew closer, I realized with growing horror what they were. Animal bones, bleached white by the sun, strung together with twine to form eerie wind chimes. My heart pounding, I approached the lean-to. The interior was dark and musty, littered with discarded food wrappers and empty water bottles. A ratty sleeping bag lay in one corner, next to a pile of clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Half buried in the dirt floor of the shelter was a small notebook. With trembling hands, I picked it up and flipped it open. The pages were filled with dense, cramped writing, interspersed with crude drawings. Most of it was gibberish, rambling passages about the watchers in the woods and the hidden world beneath the mountains. But as I flipped through, certain phrases jumped out at me. They're getting closer. I can hear them at night, scratching at the edges of reality. The lake is the key, the lake is the door. I've seen them. God help me, I've seen them. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart in my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the man from the pickup truck. His eyes were wide and feverish, his mouth twisted in a snarl. "What are you doing here?" he growled, taking a step towards me. "This is private property." I backed away, my hands raised in a placating gesture. "I'm sorry, I didn't know, I just saw the markers and—" "The markers?" He looked around wildly, as if seeing the surveyor's tape for the first time. No. You weren't supposed to find this place. Nobody was supposed to find this place." He lunged forward suddenly, his hand outstretched. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or safety. Behind me, I could hear the man's ragged breathing and the snap of branches as he gave chase. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized with a sinking heart that I was hopelessly lost. The forest around me looked the same in every direction, with no sign of the trail I'd left behind. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath and get my bearings, a sound reached my ears. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But as I listened, it grew clearer, the gentle lapping of water against a shore. Hope surged through me. If I could find the lake, I could find my way back to the campground. I set off towards the sound, pushing through the thick undergrowth. The trees began to thin, and suddenly I was standing on the shore of a vast lake. But this was no peaceful mountain pool. The water was black as ink, its surface unnaturally still. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The silence was absolute, pressing in on me like a physical weight. And then I saw it. In the center of the lake, something broke the surface. At first I thought it was a log or a piece of driftwood. But as I watched, it began to move, cutting through the water with purposeful speed. It was long, far longer than any fish I'd ever seen. Its skin was pale and glistening, reflecting the dim light in sickly patterns. And then it turned, and I saw its face. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced the impossible with courage and determination. But the truth is, I ran. I ran faster and harder than I'd ever run in my life, blind panic driving me through the forest. By some miracle, I found my way back to the campground. I burst out of the trees near my RV, startling a group of hikers preparing for a day trip. They stared at me in shock, taking in my wild eyes and torn clothing. "Are you all right, son?" one of them asked, stepping towards me cautiously. I opened my mouth to speak, to warn them about what I'd seen. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? In the end, I said nothing. I packed up my RV and left Evergreen Heights that same day, driving for hours until the mountains were nothing but a memory on the horizon. It's been 5 years since that day in the forest. I've tried to put it behind me, to convince myself that it was all just a product of stress and an overactive imagination. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the lapping of that black water. And I wonder about the man in the woods and the things he'd seen that drove him to the edge of sanity. I never went back to Evergreen Heights, but I've kept an eye on the news, watching for any strange reports or unexplained disappearances in the area. So far, there's been nothing. But sometimes I think I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flash of pale skin or the glint of inhuman eyes. And I wonder if, perhaps, I didn't leave something behind in those woods, or if something followed me out. The world is vast and ancient, full of secrets we can scarcely comprehend. And sometimes, it's better not to look too closely at the shadows, because you never know what might be looking back. 10 years have passed since my encounter at Evergreen Heights, and yet the memories remain as vivid as ever. I've tried to move on, to build a life that doesn't revolve around the inexplicable events of that summer. But some experiences, I've learned, leave an indelible mark on your soul. After leaving the park, I drove for days, putting as much distance as I could between myself and those haunted woods. I ended up in a small coastal town in Oregon, where the constant crash of waves against the shore provided a soothing counterpoint to the silence that had nearly overwhelmed me in the mountains. For the first few months, I jumped at every shadow, convinced that whatever I had seen in that black lake had followed me. I couldn't sleep without the lights on, and even then, my dreams were plagued by visions of pale, sinuous shapes moving just beneath the surface of my consciousness. It was during this time that I met Elena. She was a local artist with a quiet strength and a way of looking at the world that both intrigued and comforted me. We met at a beachside cafe, where I had taken to spending my mornings nursing endless cups of coffee as I stared out at the horizon, searching for something. I'm still not sure what. Elena saw something in me, a lost soul perhaps, or a kindred spirit. She approached me one day, sketchbook in hand, and asked if she could draw me. "There's a story in your eyes," she said, "and I'd like to capture it if you'll let me." Over the following weeks, as Elena sketched and we talked, I found myself opening up about my experiences. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or look at me like I was crazy. Instead, she listened with a thoughtful expression, occasionally asking questions that made me consider aspects of my adventure I hadn't before. "The world is full of mysteries," she told me one evening as we walked along the beach. "Some of them are beautiful, some terrifying, but they're all part of the tapestry of existence. The question is, what do we do with the knowledge of these mysteries?" It was Elena who encouraged me to write down my experiences, not necessarily to share with the world, but as a way of processing what had happened. And so, night after night, I sat at my computer, pouring out the story you've just read. As the years passed, the acute fear began to fade, replaced by a sort of wary curiosity. I started researching folklore and legends from around the world, looking for anything that might explain what I had seen. I found stories of water spirits and lake monsters, of hidden worlds and doors to other dimensions. None of them quite fit what I had experienced, but they all hinted at a reality far stranger and more complex than most of us realize. Elena and I married 3 years after we met. She's been my anchor, my touchstone in a world that sometimes feels like it's spinning out of control. We have 2 children now, a boy and a girl, and I often find myself watching them as they play, marveling at their innocence and wondering what kind of world they'll inherit. I've never told them about Evergreen Heights, how could I? But sometimes when we're camping in the backyard or hiking in the nearby state park, I see a flicker of something in their eyes, a sense of wonder at the natural world that goes beyond simple childish curiosity. And I wonder if they too can sense the mysteries that lie just beyond our perception. I've thought about going back to Evergreen Heights many times over the years. The urge is particularly strong on quiet nights when the memory of that black lake seems to call to me across the miles. But I've resisted, partly out of fear, but mostly out of a sense that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Last year, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but the postmark was from a town near Evergreen Heights. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and covered in the same cramped handwriting I remembered from the notebook I'd found in the woods. The message was brief. "They're still here, still watching. But now they know we're watching back. Thank you for seeing. Thank you for believing." It was signed simply M, the man from the pickup truck, I assume. I've often wondered what became of him, whether he's still out there in the woods, keeping his lonely vigil against forces we can barely comprehend. The package also contained a small object wrapped in cloth. When I unfolded it, I found a piece of pale, almost translucent material. It was smooth and cool to the touch, and seemed to shimmer slightly in the light. I knew without a doubt that it had come from the creature in the lake. I keep that piece of otherworldly skin in a locked box in my study. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and hold it, feeling its alien texture and wondering about the vast, unknown world it represents. It's a reminder that there are things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that defy our understanding. But it's also a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. We face the unknown, we confront our fears, and we find a way to keep going. We build lives and families, we love and we dream, all while carrying the knowledge of a larger, stranger world within us. As for me, I've found a sort of peace. The nightmares have largely subsided, replaced by a sense of wonder at the vastness of existence. I still camp, still hike, still seek out wild places, but now I do so with open eyes and an open mind, ready to embrace whatever mysteries the world might reveal. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. We step into the unknown, armed with courage and curiosity, and we see where the path leads us. Sometimes to terror, sometimes to wonder, but always to growth and understanding. And who knows? Perhaps someday when my children are older, I'll tell them about Evergreen Heights, about the man in the woods, the Black Lake, and the creature that defied explanation. Not to frighten them, but to open their eyes to the wonders and mysteries that surround us every day. Because the world is vast and ancient, full of secrets we can scarcely comprehend, and sometimes, just sometimes, we're granted a glimpse behind the veil. It's up to us what we do with that knowledge. As for me, I'll keep watching the shadows, listening for the whispers on the wind, and I'll remember that summer day in Evergreen Heights, when I learned that reality is far stranger and more beautiful than we can possibly imagine. My name is Arthur Hayes. This story is about an experience that changed my life forever, back in 1970 when I was just 20 years old. At the time, I was trapped in a monotonous job at a small factory in Indiana, feeling like my life was going nowhere. That's when an unexpected opportunity arose, offering me a chance to break free from the tedium of my daily existence. It all began with a phone call from my childhood friend Marcus. We hadn't spoken in years, but his enthusiastic voice brought back memories of our carefree youth. Marcus had always been the adventurous one, and now he was running a summer camp in Wisconsin. He asked if I wanted to join him as a counselor for the season. "Come on, Arthur," he urged. "It'll be just like old times. Fresh air, beautiful scenery, and a chance to make a difference in kids' lives. What do you say?" I hesitated for a moment. The outdoors had never really been my strong suit, and the thought of being responsible for a group of children was somewhat daunting. But as I glanced around my small, dingy apartment and thought about another day at the factory, I made up my mind. "You know what, Marcus? I'm in. When do I start?" And just like that, I was off on an adventure that would change the course of my life. The camp was called Evergreen Lake, nestled in the heart of Wisconsin's dense forests. As I drove up the winding dirt road, the towering pines seemed to close in around me, creating a tunnel of green. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and earth. It was a world away from the smog and noise of my industrial hometown. Marcus greeted me with a bear hug when I arrived, his face tanned and weathered from years of outdoor living. "Welcome to paradise, old friend," he grinned, gesturing to the rustic wooden buildings scattered around a pristine lake. Over the next few days, I met the rest of the staff. There was Eleanor, the no-nonsense head cook with a heart of gold, Hank, the gruff but skilled handyman, and two younger counselors, Lily and Jake, both college students working their summer jobs. We spent the week before the campers arrived getting everything ready. I painted cabins, cleared trails, and helped repair the old dock by the lake. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way I'd never experienced before. In the evenings, we'd gather around the campfire, sharing stories and dreams under a sky full of stars I'd never seen in the city. Marcus loved to regale us with local legends, his eyes twinkling in the firelight as he spoke of the camp's supposed haunted history. One night, he told us about old Tom Erickson, a hermit who used to live deep in the woods. "They say old Tom went mad after his family died in a blizzard," Marcus said, his voice low and dramatic. "He retreated into the forest, building a cabin far from civilization. The story goes that he still roams these woods, whistling an eerie tune to lure in unsuspecting hikers." I rolled my eyes, taking a swig from my beer. "Come on, Marcus, you don't expect us to believe that, do you?" But Lily, the youngest of our group, looked genuinely spooked. "Have you ever heard the whistling?" she asked, her eyes wide. Marcus shrugged mysteriously. "Maybe once or twice, but who knows? It could just be the wind playing tricks on us." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't help noticing how Lily kept glancing nervously at the dark line of trees surrounding our little circle of light. The first few weeks of camp passed in a blur of activity. The kids arrived, full of energy and excitement, and suddenly our days were filled with swimming lessons, nature hikes, and arts and crafts. I surprised myself by how much I enjoyed it. There was something rewarding about seeing the joy on a child's face when they caught their first fish or successfully built their first campfire. One evening, about halfway through the summer, Jake and I decided to take a group of older campers on a sunset hike to Hawks Point, a scenic overlook Marcus had told us about. The trail was a bit overgrown, winding through dense forest before opening up to a breathtaking view of the lake and surrounding wilderness. As we stood there, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. But as darkness fell and we began our trek back to camp, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The forest seemed different in the twilight, the familiar trail now shadowy and strange. As we neared the camp, I thought I heard something. A faint melodic whistle carried on the breeze. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. "Jake," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He frowned, shaking his head. "Hear what?" "That whistling. It's coming from the woods." The kids had fallen silent, picking up on my tension. Jake forced a laugh. "It's probably just the wind, Arthur. Come on, we're almost back." We made it to the camp without further incident, but the sound of that whistle stayed with me. That night I tossed and turned in my bunk, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days passed without incident, and I began to think I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, late one night as I was doing my final rounds of the camp, I heard it again. The whistle, closer this time, coming from the edge of the forest. My heart pounding, I called out, "Who's there?" No answer came, just the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. I hurried back to my cabin, double-checking the lock before collapsing onto my bed. In the morning, I told Marcus and the others about what I'd heard. Lily looked terrified, but Hank just scoffed. "You city boys," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Always jumping at shadows. There's nothing out there but trees and critters." But Marcus looked thoughtful. "Maybe we should keep a closer eye on things," he said. "Set up a night watch, just to be safe." And so began our nightly patrols. We took turns, walking the perimeter of the camp with flashlights and walkie-talkies. For a while, everything was quiet. But then, on my third night of patrol, something happened that I'll never forget. I was near the boathouse when I noticed the door was ajar. I was sure I'd closed it earlier. As I approached, I saw a shadow move inside. My heart racing, I called out, "Hey, who's in there?" A figure darted out of the boathouse, running towards the woods. Without thinking, I gave chase. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I ran, barely illuminating the path ahead. I could hear footsteps crashing through the underbrush, always just out of sight. Suddenly, the sound stopped. I found myself in a small clearing, panting heavily, my flashlight beam sweeping the trees. And then I heard it, that haunting whistle, closer than ever before. It seemed to come from all around me, filling the air with its eerie melody. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. In response, the whistling grew louder, and I swear I saw movement in the shadows between the trees. Panic overtook me, and I ran blindly back towards the camp, branches whipping at my face and arms. I burst into the main lodge where Marcus was going over the next day's schedule. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Arthur, what happened?" he asked, guiding me to a chair. Between gasps, I told him everything. The figure in the boathouse, the chase through the woods, and the whistling that seemed to follow me. Marcus listened intently, his brow furrowed with concern. "We need to call the police," he said finally. "This isn't some ghost story anymore. Someone's out there, and they're up to no good." The local sheriff arrived the next morning, but his search of the woods turned up nothing. No strange cabin, no evidence of anyone living out there. He advised us to keep the camp locked down at night and promised to send extra patrols to the area. For the next week, we were on high alert. The carefree atmosphere of the camp was gone, replaced by a tense vigilance. The kids picked up on our unease, and we had to work hard to keep their spirits up. Then, late one night, it all came to a head. I was awakened by a scream from one of the girls' cabins. I rushed out to find Lily trying to calm a group of terrified campers. "She's gone," Lily said, her face pale in the moonlight. Abigail's missing. We searched the camp frantically, hoping the girl had just wandered off. But as the sky began to lighten with the first rays of dawn, we had to face the terrible truth. Abigail was gone. The police arrived, and the camp became a hive of activity. Parents were called, search parties were organized, and soon the woods were filled with the sound of voices calling Abigail's name. As the day wore on with no sign of the missing girl, I found myself drawn back to the clearing where I'd heard the whistling. Something about it nagged at me, a detail I couldn't quite place. And then I saw it, a glint of metal, half hidden by leaves. I brushed away the forest debris to reveal a small trapdoor set into the ground. My heart pounding, I called for the others. The sheriff arrived with his deputies, and together we pried open the heavy door. A ladder led down into darkness. The beam of a powerful flashlight revealed a small underground room, filled with old furniture and boxes. And there, huddled in a corner, was Abigail. The girl was scared but unharmed. As we brought her up into the sunlight, she told us about the man who had taken her, an old hermit with wild eyes and a beard down to his chest. He had whistled as he carried her through the woods, she said, a tune that made her feel sleepy and confused. The police found the old man a few hours later, trying to flee deeper into the forest. He was Tom Erickson's grandson, it turned out, raised on his grandfather's tales of a hidden world in the woods. He had been living in that underground bunker for years, occasionally venturing out to steal supplies from the camp and, in his twisted mind, to rescue children from the corrupting influence of the modern world. In the days that followed, the camp was closed down. Parents came to collect their children, and soon the cabin stood empty and silent. Marcus tried to put a brave face on it, talking about rebuilding and reopening next summer. But I could see in his eyes that he knew it was over. The magic of Evergreen Lake had been shattered. As for me, I went back to Indiana, but I couldn't settle back into my old life. The experience had changed me, opened my eyes to a world beyond the factory walls. Within a year, I had enrolled in college, the first step on a path that would lead me to a career in child psychology. Now, all these years later, I still think about that summer at Evergreen Lake, about the beauty of the forest, the joy of working with the children, and yes, the terror of those nights when an eerie whistle floated on the breeze. Sometimes in my dreams, I find myself back in those woods, searching for something I can never quite find. But mostly, I remember the lessons I learned there, about courage, about community, and about the thin line between reality and the stories we tell ourselves. And every now and then, when the wind blows just right, I catch myself listening for a whistle that I know I'll never hear again. My name is Marcus Alvarez. The events I'm about to recount took place in the summer of 2010, a time that will forever be etched in my memory. Back then, I was struggling through one of the darkest periods of my life. My younger sister, Elena, had recently passed away in a tragic boating accident, and the weight of her loss was crushing me. I've always been somewhat of an introvert, finding solace in nature rather than in the company of others. So, when the grief became too much to bear, I decided to embark on a solo hiking trip in the vast wilderness of Montana. Something about the rugged, untamed landscape called to me, offering a promise of healing that I desperately needed. With a heavy heart and a glimmer of hope, I packed my old trusty backpack with the essentials: a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, enough canned food to last a week, a water filtration system, and a detailed topographical map of the area. I also threw in a few books, my sister's favorites, as a way to keep her memory close. The journey began on a warm June morning. I loaded up my beat-up Ford pickup, the same one Elena and I had gone on countless adventures in, and hit the road. The plan was to spend 10 days in the wilderness, just me in the great outdoors, hoping to find some peace and maybe rediscover a part of myself that had been lost since Elena's death. As I drove further away from civilization, the landscape gradually changed. The sprawling suburbs gave way to rolling hills, which in turn transformed into dense forests punctuated by jagged mountain peaks. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead of the Evergreen Wilderness Trail. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot as I shouldered my pack and took my first steps into the forest. The trail started off easy enough, winding through towering pines and fragrant cedar trees. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the songs of various birds I couldn't identify. Elena would have known them all, I thought with a pang of sadness. She had always been the nature expert between us. After a few hours of hiking, I found a suitable spot to set up camp for the night. It was a small clearing near a bubbling stream, the sound of running water providing a soothing backdrop. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and soon had a small campfire crackling merrily. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of beans and jerky, staring into the flames and letting my mind wander. For the first time since Elena's death, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The forest seemed to embrace me, its ancient presence a balm to my wounded soul. That night I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the gentle whisper of wind through the trees and the distant hooting of an owl. The next few days passed in a blur of hiking, exploring, and quiet contemplation. I pushed deeper into the wilderness, following the trail as it climbed higher into the mountains. The scenery was breathtaking. Crystal clear alpine lakes reflecting snow-capped peaks, meadows bursting with wildflowers, and valleys so deep and vast, they seemed to stretch on forever. I spent my evenings reading Elena's books by firelight, feeling closer to her with each page I turned. During the day, I hiked until my legs ached, pushing myself physically as if I could somehow outrun the grief that had followed me into these woods. On the 5th day, I reached a particularly beautiful spot, a high mountain pass that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. I decided to set up camp there, planning to spend a couple of days exploring the area. That evening, as I sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I felt the first stirrings of peace. Maybe, just maybe, I was starting to heal. But as the old saying goes, the darkest hour is just before dawn, and my dawn was still a long way off. The next morning I set off on what I thought would be a simple day hike. The trail I chose wasn't on my map, but it looked well worn enough, and I figured it would loop back to my campsite eventually. How wrong I was. As the day wore on, the trail became increasingly overgrown and difficult to follow. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late afternoon when I first noticed the smell. At first, it was just a faint whiff carried on the breeze, something rotten and sickly sweet. I tried to ignore it, but as I continued down the trail, it grew stronger. The stench of decay filled my nostrils, making me gag. Rounding a bend in the trail, I suddenly came face to face with the source of the smell. In a small clearing just off the path lay the carcass of a large elk. But this was no natural death. The animal's throat had been brutally slashed, its belly cut open with surgical precision. Organs and entrails were strewn about, some arranged in what looked disturbingly like purposeful patterns. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This wasn't the work of a mountain lion or a bear. No animal I knew of would do something like this. A chill ran down my spine as the realization hit me. This was the work of a human. And not just any human, but someone deeply disturbed. Panic rising in my throat, I turned to hurry back the way I had come. But in my haste to get away from the grisly scene, I lost track of the trail. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just hours ago now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, and every snapping twig made me jump. As darkness began to fall, I realized with growing horror that I was lost. My campsite, with all my supplies, was who knows how far away. I had only a small day pack with some water and a few energy bars. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I knew that a night out here, unprepared, could be deadly. Forcing myself to remain calm, I found a relatively sheltered spot between some large boulders and settled in for the night. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, the eastern sky began to lighten. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I set off, determined to find my way back to the main trail. But the forest seemed different in the pale morning light, unfamiliar and maze-like. It was mid-morning when I stumbled upon the abandoned campsite. At first, I felt a surge of relief. Other people meant help, a way out of this nightmare. But as I got closer, that relief turned to ice in my veins. The campsite had been destroyed. A tent lay in shreds, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Clothing torn and blood-stained hung from low branches like some kind of macabre decoration. And there, half hidden under a fallen backpack, was a hand. Just a hand, severed at the wrist. I recoiled in horror, bile rising in my throat. This was no accident, no animal attack. This was something far worse. With trembling hands, I searched through the scattered belongings, looking for anything that might tell me who these unfortunate campers had been. I found a wallet, the leather stained dark with what I feared was blood. The driver's license inside bore the name Thomas Erickson, with an address in Bozeman. I pocketed it, promising myself that if I made it out of here, I'd make sure Thomas's family knew what had happened to him. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. At first, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, movement caught my eye. A figure stepped out from behind a large pine, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a man, but he hardly looked human. Tall and gaunt, with long matted hair and a wild beard, he was dressed in what looked like animal skins crudely stitched together. His eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a feral madness that sent shivers down my spine. In his hand, he clutched a large hunting knife, its blade dark with dried blood. For a moment, we just stared at each other, a tableau frozen in time. Then, slowly, his cracked lips spread into a horrifying grin, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. Pure, primal fear took over, and I ran. I ran like I had never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his maniacal laughter echoing through the trees. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find help. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. The sound of pursuit was always there, sometimes fading slightly, but never disappearing completely. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line and found myself on the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could see a river rushing over rocks. For a split second, I hesitated. Then I heard his voice, closer now, calling out in a sing-song tone. "Where are you, little rabbit? Come out, wherever you are." I made my decision in an instant. Taking a deep breath, I threw myself over the edge of the ravine. The world spun around me as I tumbled down the steep slope, frantically grabbing at bushes and roots to slow my descent. Pain exploded through my body as I hit rocks and branches, but somehow, miraculously, I reached the bottom without breaking any bones. Dazed and battered, I dragged myself to my feet and plunged into the icy river. The current was strong, threatening to pull me under, but I fought against it with every ounce of strength I had left. I let it carry me downstream, away from the madman who had been pursuing me. I don't know how long I was in the water. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when I finally dragged myself onto the shore, I was miles from where I had entered the river. My clothes were torn, my body covered in cuts and bruises, and I was shivering uncontrollably. But I was alive. It took me 2 more days to find my way back to civilization. 2 days of wandering through the wilderness, jumping at every sound, terrified that the wild man would find me again. When I finally stumbled onto a hiking trail and encountered a group of startled day trippers, I broke down in tears of relief. The authorities were skeptical of my story at first, but when they found Thomas Erickson's campsite and later, The remains of 3 other hikers who had gone missing over the past year. They had to take me seriously. They organized a massive manhunt, but they never found the wild man. It was as if he had vanished into the forest like a ghost. It's been years since that horrifying experience, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to move on with my life. I have a good job now, a loving wife, even a kid on the way. But sometimes in the dead of night I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that maniacal laughter ringing in my ears. I don't go hiking anymore, at least not in remote areas. The wilderness that once brought me solace now fills me with dread. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for his next victim. So if you ever find yourself in the mountains of Montana, stick to the well-traveled paths. Don't wander off into the unknown, no matter how tempting it might seem. Because you never know what kind of monsters might be hiding just beyond the trees. And trust me, some things are better left undiscovered. The forest may be beautiful, but it can also be deadly. It holds secrets darker than you can imagine. I learned that the hard way, and it's a lesson I'll never forget. My name is Michael Donovan. But the story I'm about to tell you happened back in 2002 when I was just 30. It's a tale that's haunted me for years, one that changed the way I look at the wilderness and the shadows that lurk within it. I've always been what you might call a nature enthusiast. The great outdoors was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the hustle and bustle of city life and find some peace. Weekends would often find me hiking trails or camping in state parks, seeking that quiet solitude that only nature can provide. I never quite fit into the typical 9-to-5 grind, so these escapes were my lifeline, keeping me sane in a world that often felt too loud and too fast. I was a bit of a loner, which suited me just fine. Don't get me wrong, I had friends, but they were few and carefully chosen. Quality over quantity, as they say. My idea of a good time wasn't hitting the bars or attending big parties. It was a weekend in the mountains, away from the chaos of civilization. That year I had planned a solo hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a stretch I hadn't yet explored. I'd heard whispers about the beauty of Evergreen Ridge, and it seemed like the perfect spot to unwind and reconnect with nature. I meticulously packed my gear, double-checking everything from my first aid kit to my water purification tablets. Early one Saturday morning in late September, I loaded up my old Jeep Cherokee and hit the road, the excitement of adventure coursing through my veins. As I drove, I remember joking to myself about finding Bigfoot or stumbling upon some hidden Appalachian mystery. Little did I know I'd soon be wishing it was just a mythical creature I'd encounter. The weather was perfect when I arrived at the trailhead, clear blue skies with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. I shouldered my pack, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air and set off down the trail. The first few miles were a hiker's dream. The path wound through dense forests of oak and hickory, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and red. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. About 10 miles in, I found a spot that seemed tailor-made for camping. It was a small clearing nestled between 2 ridges, with a babbling brook nearby and a perfect view of the surrounding hills. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It was one of those rare moments where everything just felt right with the world. That first night passed uneventfully. I woke at dawn, the cool mountain air nipping at my nose as I crawled out of my tent. I brewed some coffee on my camp stove, its rich aroma mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, I set out to explore the area. I had a topographic map with me and had spotted a promising peak about 3 miles from my campsite. The trail was challenging but rewarding, winding up steep inclines and along narrow ridges. I reached the summit around noon, and the view took my breath away. Rolling mountains stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of green dotted with splashes of autumn color. I spent a good hour up there, munching on my packed lunch and snapping photos with my old film camera. It was on the way back to camp that I first noticed something odd. There were boot prints on the trail that hadn't been there earlier. They looked fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft earth. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. I hadn't seen another soul all day, and this stretch of the mountains wasn't exactly a popular hiking spot. Still, I told myself, other people have every right to be out here enjoying nature. I shrugged it off and continued back to my camp. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. I gathered more firewood and set about preparing my dinner, a simple meal of dehydrated chili that I rehydrated over my camp stove. As I sat by my small fire, enjoying the warmth of the chili and the cool evening air, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, I thought. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the sound. The beam cut through the gathering darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. After dinner, I sat by the fire reading a book I'd brought along, a well-worn copy of Jack London's Call of the Wild. The irony of my choice of reading material wouldn't occur to me until much later. As I read, the sounds of the forest at night surrounded me. The hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. But then I heard that sound again, the one that didn't quite fit. This time it came from a different direction. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, its beam seeming feeble against the vast blackness of the forest. Again, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Deciding that my imagination was getting the better of me, I turned in early, making sure my tent was securely zipped and my gear was stowed safely. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, every snapping twig or rustling leaf jolting me awake. It was in the deepest part of the night when I heard it, a sort of muffled crunching noise, unmistakably close. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening intently. It was just outside my tent. With trembling hands, I slowly unzipped the tent flap, peeking out with my flashlight. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting an eerie, flickering light over the campsite. In that dim light, I saw a figure crouched by my food stash. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of instinct than bravery. The figure stood up abruptly, and I could see it was a man. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say a word, just stared at me for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he bolted into the woods. I scrambled out of my tent, grabbing my hunting knife as I went. My heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I checked my food stash and saw that some of it was missing. The guy had been rummaging through my stuff. Anger and fear churned in my gut. Who was he? What did he want? I stayed up the rest of the night, my knife clutched tightly in my hand, listening for any sign of the man's return. But the forest had fallen silent, save for the usual night sounds. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a decision. This trip was over. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting the stranger to emerge from the trees at any moment. The peaceful solitude I had been seeking was shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that seemed to seep into my bones. I started hiking back towards the trailhead, my senses on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. About halfway back, I came across another set of boot prints, fresh ones, leading off the main trail. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me. Maybe I could find out who this guy was and why he was out here. I followed the prints, moving as quietly as I could. They led me deeper into the woods, away from the marked trails. After about an hour of careful tracking, I saw something through the trees that made me stop in my tracks. There, in a small clearing, stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned at first glance, but then I noticed a thin wisp of smoke rising from a makeshift chimney. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. As I got closer, I could hear voices inside. It wasn't just one person. There were at least two, maybe three distinct voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was hushed, urgent. I crouched behind a large oak tree, trying to decide what to do next. Should I try to get closer? Should I go back and report this to the authorities? While I was weighing my options, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of a car engine in the distance coming from the direction of the trailhead. Panic set in. I had to get out of there, and fast. As I turned to leave, my foot came down on a dry twig. The snap seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. The cabin door flew open, and the man from the previous night stepped out, followed by two others. They scanned the forest, their eyes searching for the source of the noise. I held my breath, pressing myself against the tree, praying they wouldn't see me. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds, they went back inside. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my lungs burning and my legs aching. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, my car a welcome sight in the small parking area. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, peeling out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel. I drove straight to the nearest town, my mind racing as fast as my car. What had I stumbled upon? Who were those men? What were they doing out there in that isolated cabin? I pulled into the parking lot of the local sheriff's office, took a few deep breaths to calm myself, and went inside. The deputy on duty listened carefully as I recounted my story, taking notes and asking a few questions. He seemed concerned, but not overly surprised. "We'll check it out," he said, closing his notebook. "You did the right thing coming to us. We've had reports of some strange goings-on up in those mountains, but nothing concrete until now." I thanked him and left, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far more dangerous than I realized. In the weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. The mountains, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a place of hidden dangers. I stopped going on solo hikes, and when I did venture out, it was always with a group and never too far from civilization. I never heard back from the sheriff's office about what, if anything, they found up there. But I did hear rumors, stories about missing hikers, about strange lights seen in the mountains at night, about people who went into those woods and came back, changed. I don't know how much of it was true, how much was exaggeration, and how much was pure fabrication. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and it was enough to keep me away. Years passed and life went on. I got married, had kids, moved to a different state, but I never forgot about that weekend in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It would come back to me in dreams sometimes. The crunch of footsteps outside my tent, the silhouette of that cabin in the woods, the fear of discovery as I hid behind that old oak tree. One day, about 5 years after my experience, I was visiting an old college buddy in Asheville. We were sitting on his porch enjoying a couple of beers and swapping stories when the conversation turned to hiking. Without really meaning to, I found myself recounting my experience in Evergreen Ridge. My friend Jake listened intently, his brow furrowing as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know, there have been reports of some sketchy activity up in those parts for years. Illegal stuff, drug operations, poaching, who knows what else. Sounds like you might have stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to see." I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warm evening. "Great," I laughed, though it wasn't really funny. "Just my luck." We talked a bit more about it, and I felt a strange mix of vindication and renewed unease. On one hand, it was comforting to know that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing, that there was potentially a rational explanation for what I had encountered. But on the other hand, it opened up a whole new set of questions. What exactly had I stumbled upon? How dangerous were those men really? And why had they let me go? I guess some questions never get answered. Life goes on and you learn to live with the uncertainty. But even now, all these years later, When I'm out in nature, whether it's a family camping trip or just a walk in the local park, I find myself more aware of my surroundings. I notice things I might not have before. A snapped twig, a rustling in the bushes, the feeling of being watched. My experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. It reminded me that even in our modern world, there are still wild places where the old rules don't apply, where the line between civilization and wilderness blurs. So if you're ever hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains, or any remote area for that matter, and you see boot prints that don't belong, or hear rustling in the bushes at night, be careful. You never know what or who you might find out there. And if you're like me, you'll make sure to stick to the well-traveled paths and keep your wits about you, because in the end, it's not always the bears or the wolves you have to worry about in the wilderness. Sometimes the most dangerous creatures in the forest walk on two legs, and they're the ones that leave no trace, save for the stories told around campfires and the lingering fear in the hearts of those who've encountered them. As for me, I still love nature, but now I prefer to enjoy it from a safer distance. Maybe someday I'll go back to those mountains, face my fears and lay those old ghosts to rest. But if I do, you can bet I won't be alone, and I'll definitely be better prepared, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some shadows are better left unexplored. My name is Malcolm Reyes, and I'm 51 years old now. But when this story began, I was just 27, full of restless energy and an insatiable appetite for adventure. It was the summer of 2000, and the world seemed full of possibilities. Looking back, I realize how naive I was, how unprepared for the darkness that lurked in the shadows of our seemingly ordinary lives. I grew up in a small town in Missouri, the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. My childhood wasn't easy. I lost my younger sister, Elena, to leukemia when I was 10. The loss hit our family hard, especially my father. He retreated into himself, burying his grief in long hours at the local factory. My mother, Maria, became the glue that held us together, her strength a quiet but constant presence in our lives. Perhaps it was this early brush with tragedy that made me cling so fiercely to life, to seek out experiences that made me feel alive. Or maybe it was just the restlessness of youth, the belief that I was invincible. Whatever the reason, I found myself drawn to challenges, to pushing my limits in ways both big and small. It was this spirit of adventure that led me to befriend Alex Donovan in high school. Alex was everything I wasn't: outgoing, effortlessly funny, and seemingly without a care in the world. Where I was cautious, he was reckless. Where I overthought, he acted on impulse. We were an unlikely pair, but somehow we balanced each other out. Alex had a way of turning even the most mundane situations into adventures. I remember one winter night when his beat-up Chevy broke down on the outskirts of town. Instead of calling for help, Alex decided we should try to fix it ourselves, in the middle of a snowstorm. We ended up covered in grease, shivering, and no closer to getting the car started. But Alex just laughed, pulled out a thermos of hot chocolate he'd packed just in case, and declared it the best night ever. That was Alex, always prepared for the wrong scenario, but somehow making it work. His optimism was infectious, and over the years I found myself adopting some of his carefree attitude. Not all of it, mind you. Someone had to be the voice of reason in our friendship. But enough that when Alex suggested we take a camping trip that summer, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We chose Ozark National Forest in Arkansas as our destination. It was far enough from home to feel like a real adventure, but not so remote that we'd be completely cut off from civilization. Alex's enthusiasm was contagious as we planned our trip, poring over maps and gear lists with the seriousness of generals planning a military campaign. "This is going to be epic, Mal," Alex said, his eyes shining with excitement. "Just you and me, roughing it in the wilderness. Who knows what we'll discover out there?" I laughed, caught up in his enthusiasm. Knowing our luck, probably poison ivy and a family of angry raccoons. Alex grinned. That's the spirit. Adventure awaits. Little did we know just how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The day of our departure dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer morning that seems full of promise. We loaded up Alex's ancient Ford pickup, a vehicle that seemed held together more by rust and Alex's stubborn optimism than any sound mechanical principle. The truck bed was a jumble of tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and enough supplies to last us a week in the wilderness. As we pulled out of my driveway, my mother stood on the porch, worry etched on her face. "Be careful out there, boys," she called. "And Malcolm, make sure you keep an eye on Alex. Lord knows that boy needs supervision." Alex leaned out the window, flashing her his most charming smile. "Don't worry, Mrs. Reyes. I'll take good care of your boy. We'll be back before you know it with lots of stories to tell." If only we had known then what kind of stories we'd be bringing back. The drive to Arkansas was long but enjoyable. Alex had put together a road trip playlist that was an eclectic mix of classic rock, 90s hip-hop, and what he called Campfire sing-alongs. We belted out off-key renditions of everything from Born to Be Wild to Baby Got Back, laughing at our own ridiculousness. As we crossed the state line into Arkansas, the landscape began to change. The flat farmland of Missouri gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The air seemed to change too, becoming thicker, more humid, filled with the scent of pine and wild growth. "Can you feel that, Mal?" Alex asked, his voice hushed with awe. "That's the call of the wild. It's in our blood, you know. We're answering a primal urge, returning to our roots as hunter-gatherers." I snorted. Says the guy who can barely operate a can opener. "Face it, Alex, we're just two city boys playing at being outdoorsmen." He shook his head, undeterred. "That's where you're wrong, my friend. This trip is going to change us. We're going to come back different men." I had no idea then how right he would turn out to be. We arrived at the campground in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. We chose a spot near a small lake, far enough from the other campers to give us some privacy, but still within shouting distance if we needed help. Setting up camp was a comedy of errors. Alex insisted he knew how to pitch a tent, but after an hour of struggling with poles and guy lines, we ended up with something that looked more like a collapsed circus big top than a shelter. I finally took over, following the instructions step by step until we had a passable, if slightly lopsided, tent. As darkness fell, we sat by our campfire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows. The night was alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Above us, the sky was a riot of stars, more than I'd ever seen in the city. "This is the life, isn't it?" Alex said, leaning back in his camp chair. "No phones, no internet, no responsibilities, just us and nature." I had to admit it was pretty amazing. Despite the mosquitoes and the hard ground beneath us, there was something peaceful about being out here, away from the constant noise and rush of our everyday lives. As we sat there, Alex began to tell ghost stories. He had a talent for it, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper at just the right moments, building tension until I found myself jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. "And they say," Alex concluded his latest tale, "that on nights like this, when the moon is full and the air is still, you can still hear the whispers of the lost hikers, calling out for help that will never come." A chill ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the fire. "Okay, that's enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's talk about something else." Alex laughed. "Aw, is little Malcolm scared? Don't worry. I'll protect you from the big bad forest monsters." I threw a marshmallow at him, which he caught in his mouth with a grin. "I'm not scared," I protested. "I just think we should be respectful. You never know what's out there in the dark." "That's the spirit," Alex said. "Embrace the mystery, the unknown. That's what this trip is all about." As we turned in for the night, crawling into our slightly crooked tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, sparked by Alex's stories and the unfamiliar surroundings. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets these woods might be hiding. The next few days passed in a blur of hiking, fishing, and soaking in the natural beauty around us. We explored the marked trails, marveling at ancient trees that seemed to touch the sky and crystal-clear streams that bubbled over moss-covered rocks. Alex, true to form, managed to turn even the simplest activities into adventures. One afternoon, while we were trying our hand at fishing in the lake near our campsite, Alex decided he wanted to catch a fish with his bare hands. "It's called noodling," he explained, stripping down to his shorts. "The locals do it all the time." Before I could stop him, he waded into the water, feeling along the muddy bottom with his feet. "You just have to find a hole where a catfish might be hiding," he called back to me. "Then you stick your hand in and whoa!" Alex suddenly disappeared under the water. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he'd been pulled under by some monster fish. But then he surfaced, spluttering and laughing, holding aloft a wriggling catfish nearly as long as his arm. "I did it," he crowed, his face split in a triumphant grin. "Did you see that, Mal? I'm a natural." I couldn't help but laugh at his enthusiasm, even as I helped him back to shore. "You're insane, you know that. You could have drowned." Alex just shrugged, still beaming, but I didn't. And now we have dinner. That night, as we feasted on grilled catfish, Alex proposed a new adventure. "I found this old map at a garage sale before we left," he said, pulling a worn piece of paper from his backpack. "It shows some trails that aren't on the official park maps. What do you say we do some real exploring tomorrow?" I hesitated. The official trails were challenging enough, and at least they were well marked. "I don't know, Alex. It could be dangerous. What if we get lost?" "That's what compasses are for," Alex said, waving away my concerns. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? This could be our chance to discover something amazing." Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. Alex's enthusiasm was hard to resist, and part of me was curious about what we might find off the beaten path. The next morning we set out early, our backpacks laden with water, snacks, and emergency supplies. The unofficial trail was barely visible, just a faint path through the underbrush. Alex led the way, map in hand, occasionally consulting his compass. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow taller, their canopy blocking out more and more of the sky. The air grew thick and humid, filled with the buzz of insects and the calls of unfamiliar birds. Despite the heat, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about this part of the forest felt different, older, somehow. Wilder. "Alex," I called out, swatting away a persistent mosquito. "Are you sure we're going the right way? I don't like the look of this." "Relax, Mal," Alex said, not even turning around. "We're fine. The map shows a clearing up ahead. We can rest there and get our bearings." I was about to argue further when I noticed something strange. Off to our right, partially hidden by a tangle of vines, was what looked like a structure of some kind. "Alex, wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Look over there, do you see that?" Alex squinted in the direction I was pointing. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "Is that a cabin?" We approached cautiously. As we got closer, we could see that it was indeed a cabin, though it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was weathered and rotting in places, the windows were shattered, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. "This isn't on the map," Alex said, his voice a mix of excitement and confusion. "What do you think it is? An old ranger station?" I shook my head. Something about the cabin made my skin crawl. "I don't know, but I don't like it. We should go back." But Alex was already moving towards the door, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "Come on, Mal. Where's your sense of adventure? This could be the discovery of a lifetime." As Alex pushed open the creaking door, I found myself following, driven by a mix of curiosity and the need to keep an eye on my reckless friend. Little did I know we were about to stumble into a nightmare that would change our lives forever. The interior of the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else. something metallic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom through gaps in the walls and roof. Alex pulled out his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with what looked like homemade items. A rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed frame with a rotting mattress in one corner. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. "This place gives me the creeps," I muttered, staying close to the door. "We shouldn't be here, Alex. This is someone's property." Alex, however, was in full explorer mode. He moved further into the cabin, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. "Look at this stuff, Mal," he said, his voice hushed with excitement. "This place must be ancient. I wonder who lived here." As he spoke, his light fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind the remains of what might have been a cupboard, was a pile of bones. "Alex," I said, my voice shaking, "we need to leave. Now." But Alex had seen the bones too, and instead of retreating, he moved closer. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Are those human?" Before I could stop him, he was kneeling by the pile, examining the bones closely. "These are definitely human," he said, "but they're old. Really old. Look at how they're discolored." I felt like I was going to be sick. "Alex, please, we need to go. We need to report this to the Rangers or the police or someone." Alex stood up, brushing dust from his knees. For once, he looked serious. "You're right," he said, "but first we should look around a bit more. There might be clues about what happened here." Part of me wanted to run to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part, the part that had grown up reading mystery novels and watching detective shows, was curious. What had happened here? Who were these bones, and how had they ended up in this forgotten cabin? We began to search the cabin more thoroughly. In what must have been the kitchen area, we found a collection of rusty cans and jars, their labels long since rotted away. A fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney clogged with years of debris. As Alex examined the fireplace, I noticed something odd about the floorboards near the bed. They seemed uneven somehow. Kneeling down, I ran my hand over the rough wood. There was definitely something off about this section of floor. "Alex," I called, "come look at this." Together we managed to pry up one of the floorboards. Beneath it was a small space, and in that space was a book. It was old, its leather cover cracked and faded, but it had been protected from the worst of the elements by its hiding place. With trembling hands, I opened it. It was a journal, the pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. The ink had faded in places, making it hard to read, but what I could make out sent chills down my spine. "June 15th, 1952, I read aloud. "The voices are getting louder. They want me to do terrible things. I don't know how much longer I can resist." Alex leaned in, his face pale in the dim light. "What the hell is this, Mal?" I flipped through more pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. The writer spoke of dark rituals, of sacrifices made to appease some unnamed entity. The later entries became increasingly incoherent, filled with rambling descriptions of visions and voices. The final entry, dated October 31st, 1953, simply read, "It is done. May God forgive me." We looked at each other, the implications of what we'd found sinking in. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. It was a crime scene, the site of unspeakable acts committed decades ago. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to tell someone about this." Alex nodded, his usual bravado gone. "Yeah, you're right, let's—" He was cut off by a sound that made both of us freeze. Footsteps, coming from outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that were getting closer. We looked at each other in panic. There was nowhere to hide in the small cabin, nowhere to run. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a creak that seemed to echo in the stillness, the door began to open. The figure that stepped into the cabin was tall and lean, dressed in tattered clothes that might once have been a park ranger's uniform. His face was hidden beneath a thick, unkempt beard, and his eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something dangerous. He carried an old hunting rifle, which he raised as soon as he saw us. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough as if from disuse. "What are you doing here?" Alex and I raised our hands slowly, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "We're just campers," I said, my voice shaking. "We found this cabin by accident. We didn't mean to trespass." The man's eyes darted around the room, taking in the disturbed floorboards and the journal in my hand. His grip on the rifle tightened. "You've seen it," he said. "You've read it." "We don't understand what's going on," Alex said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Please, just let us go. We won't tell anyone about this place." The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You don't understand," he said. "Nobody leaves. Nobody can leave. It won't let them." As he spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On his left hand, barely visible beneath the grime and dirt, was a ring. A ring that matched the description in the journal of one worn by the writer. "You're him, aren't you?" I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You wrote that journal, but that's impossible. That was over 50 years ago." The man's face twisted into a grimace. "Time doesn't work right here," he said. "Nothing works right here, not since I made the deal." "What deal?" Alex asked. "What are you talking about?" But the man wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had taken on a glazed look, and he was muttering to himself. "It's hungry," he was saying. "It's always hungry, but maybe if I give it you, it'll let me go. Yes, that's it. You can take my place." He leveled the rifle at us, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I saw Alex tensing beside me, ready to move. I saw the madness in the old man's eyes, the desperation of someone who had been trapped for far too long. And then, just as I thought it was all over, something extraordinary happened. The cabin began to shake. At first, I thought it was an earthquake. But then I realized the tremors were coming from beneath us. The floorboards began to splinter and crack, and a sound rose up from below. A sound that was part growl, part scream, and wholly inhuman. The old man's eyes widened in terror. "No," he whispered. "No, not now. Please, not now." But his pleas went unanswered. The floor exploded upwards in a shower of rotting wood and dirt. And from the hole that was left behind, something began to emerge. Something dark, and ancient, and hungry. In the chaos that followed, several things happened at once. The old man, faced with the very thing he had been running from for so long, turned and fled, dropping his rifle in his haste. Alex, showing a presence of mind I wouldn't have believed possible, grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the door. And the thing, whatever it was, let out a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. We ran. We ran like we had never run before, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of pursuit, trees splintering, the earth itself seeming to heave and buck. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that we didn't stop until we literally couldn't go any further. Collapsing on the forest floor, our lungs burning, our legs feeling like jelly. As we lay there, gasping for breath, we realized that the sounds of pursuit had faded. The forest around us was quiet. Almost too quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "What?" Alex panted. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd seen. "I don't know," I said. "And I don't want to know. We need to get out of here, Alex. We need to get back to civilization and forget this ever happened." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. We were lost, our supplies left behind in our mad dash from the cabin, and somewhere out there, In the depths of the forest was something, something that defied explanation, something that had kept that old man prisoner for decades. As the reality of our situation sank in, I felt a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just about getting back home anymore. This was about survival. And I had a feeling that before this was over, we were going to be tested in ways we had never imagined. As the adrenaline of our escape began to wear off, the full gravity of our situation hit us. We were lost in an unfamiliar part of the forest, with no supplies, no map, and no idea which direction would lead us back to civilization. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to think this through. What do we have?" Alex patted his pockets, his face grim. "I've got my Swiss Army knife, a lighter, and that's about it. You?" I checked my own pockets. A half-empty water bottle and some trail mix. Not exactly ideal for an extended stay in the woods. Alex managed a weak smile. "Hey, it's better than nothing. We're alive, Mal. After what we just saw, that's something to be grateful for." I nodded, trying to draw strength from his optimism. "You're right. Okay, first things first. We need to find water and shelter before it gets dark." We set off, trying to keep our bearings as best we could. I remembered reading once that streams and rivers often lead to civilization, so when we heard the sound of running water, we headed towards it. The small creek we found wasn't much, but it was clear and cold. We drank deeply, refilling my water bottle. As we followed the creek, the light began to fade rapidly. The forest, which had seemed merely mysterious during the day, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. "We need to stop for the night," I said reluctantly. "It's too dangerous to keep going in the dark." Alex nodded, his face pale in the fading light. "What about—" He hesitated, glancing around nervously. "What about that thing? What if it's still out there?" I wish I could have reassured him, but the truth was, I was just as scared. "We'll take turns keeping watch," I said. "And we'll build a fire. Maybe that'll keep it away." We found a small clearing near the creek and set about gathering firewood. Thanks to Alex's lighter, we soon had a small fire going. It wasn't much, but its warmth and light were incredibly comforting in the gathering darkness. As we huddled around the fire, sharing the meager remains of my trail mix, Alex finally broke the silence. "What do you think that thing was, Mal? In the cabin?" I shook my head. "I don't know. And honestly, I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained." Alex was quiet for a moment. "You know we can't tell anyone about this, right? Even if we make it out of here, who would believe us?" He was right, of course. The thought of trying to explain what we'd seen to anyone, the police, the park rangers, even our families, seemed absurd. We'd be laughed out of town, or worse, locked up in a psychiatric ward. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Right now, let's just focus on getting out of here." We decided to take 3-hour shifts for the watch. Alex volunteered to go first, so I curled up as close to the fire as I dared and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin, the old man, the thing rising from beneath the floorboards. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. I woke to Alex shaking me gently. "Your turn," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "And Mal, I think I heard something out there, in the woods." Fully awake now, I sat up, straining my ears. At first, I heard nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. But then, there, a rustling too big to be a small animal. And was that breathing? "Wake up," I whispered urgently to Alex, who had just started to doze off. "We need to move. Now." We quickly stamped out the remains of our fire and grabbed what little we had. As we prepared to leave, a twig snapped nearby, much too close for comfort. Without a word, we began to run. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and hidden obstacles. We stumbled over roots, crashed through bushes, all the while aware of something pursuing us. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, crashing through the underbrush, letting out occasional grunts or growls that sounded like no animal I'd ever heard. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Finally, unable to go any further, we collapsed behind a large fallen tree. Peering over the top, we watched and waited, hardly daring to breathe. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, at the edge of our vision, something moved. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was all wrong. Too big to be a bear, too strange to be any normal forest animal. It paused, as if scenting the air, then slowly, mercifully, moved away. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, not daring to move until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did we slowly, cautiously, emerge from our hiding place. "What do we do now?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. In the distance, I could see a hill rising above the trees. "We need to get to high ground," I said. "Maybe we can see where we are, find a way out of this forest." Alex nodded, too exhausted to argue. As we set off towards the hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something was out there, something that didn't want us to leave. And I had a sinking feeling that before this was over, we would have to confront it. The question was, would we survive the encounter? The climb up the hill was arduous. Our muscles, already strained from the previous day's ordeal, protested with every step. The undergrowth was thick, forcing us to push through dense bushes and clamber over moss-covered rocks. By the time we reached the summit, we were both exhausted and covered in scratches. But the view made it all worth it. From the top of the hill, we could see for miles in every direction. The forest stretched out below us, a sea of green broken only by the occasional glint of water from streams or small lakes. In the far distance, I could just make out what looked like a road. "There," I said, pointing. "That has to be the highway, if we can reach it." Alex squinted in the direction I was pointing. "That's got to be at least a day's hike from here," he said. "Maybe more, given the terrain." He was right, of course. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it was hope, the first real hope we'd had since stumbling upon that cursed cabin. As we stood there, catching our breath and planning our next move, something caught my eye. Off to our left, maybe a mile or two away, was a break in the trees. It was too regular to be natural, a perfect circle of cleared land in the middle of the forest. "Alex," I said slowly, "do you see that?" He followed my gaze, his eyes widening as he spotted it. "What is that? Some kind of camping ground?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. It's too isolated, too deliberate." As we watched, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught our attention. Something was moving there, something big. We couldn't make out details at this distance, but whatever it wasn't human. "We need to go," Alex said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But even as he spoke, I felt a strange pull. That clearing, it was important somehow. I didn't know how I knew this, but I was certain of it. Whatever answers we were looking for, whatever explanation there might be for the horrors we'd experienced, they were there. "We need to check it out," I said, surprised by my own words. Alex looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Are you insane? After everything we've been through, you want to go towards the creepy clearing with the monster?" Put like that, it did sound crazy, but the pull was undeniable. "I can't explain it," I said, "but I think we're meant to go there. I think that's where this all ends." For a long moment, Alex just stared at me. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay. But if we die, I'm going to kill you." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Deal. We made our way down the hill, heading toward the clearing. As we got closer, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew older, more gnarled. The underbrush thinned out, replaced by a carpet of moss that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. And the air felt heavy, charged with some kind of energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Finally, we reached the edge of the clearing. Up close, it was even more unnatural. The trees stopped abruptly, forming a perfect circle. Inside, the ground was bare earth, marked with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. And in the center was an altar. There was no other word for it. A slab of black stone, covered in carvings that hurt my eyes to look at. And on the altar, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, was a knife. Mal, Alex whispered, his voice shaking. What is this place? Before I could answer, a voice spoke from behind us. This, it said, is where it all began, and where it must end. We spun around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the old man from the cabin. But he looked different. His eyes were clear now, free of the madness we'd seen before. He looked older, impossibly old, but there was a strength to him that hadn't been there before. Who are you? I demanded. What is this place? The old man smiled, a sad, weary expression. My name is Daniel Forrester, he said, and this is where I made a terrible mistake. A mistake I've been paying for over half a century. He gestured for us to sit. Warily, we did so, never taking our eyes off him. And there, as the sun began to set over the forest, Daniel Forrester told us a story. A story of ambition and dark magic, and a price too terrible to contemplate. I was a scientist, he began. Brilliant, they said. Too brilliant for my own good. I wanted to uncover the secrets of the universe, to understand the very fabric of reality. And in my arrogance, I thought I could control forces beyond human comprehension. Daniel Forrester's voice grew soft as he continued his tale, his eyes distant with memories. I discovered ancient texts, rituals that promised knowledge beyond imagining. I thought I could outsmart them, use their power without paying the price. I was a fool. He gestured to the altar in the center of the clearing. Here, in this very spot, I performed the ritual. I offered my blood, my very essence, in exchange for cosmic understanding. And something answered. A shudder ran through him, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the broken man we'd encountered in the cabin. It gave me what I asked for. Knowledge, yes, but also horror. I saw things no human was meant to see, understood truths that drove me to the brink of madness. And I realized, too late, the true cost of my bargain. The entity, Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. The thing we saw in the cabin. That was... Daniel nodded. A fragment of something vast and terrible. A cosmic horror that exists beyond our reality. By summoning it, I created a tear in the fabric of our world. A wound that has been festering for decades. He turned to face us fully, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made me want to look away. And now, after all these years, I finally understand why you're here. Why it led you to me. You're the key to ending this, to closing the breach once and for all. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? What do you want us to do? Daniel's gaze softened. I'm so sorry. If there was any other way. The ritual requires a sacrifice, a willing offering of two souls, bound by friendship and shared experience. With your sacrifice, the tear can be sealed, the entity banished back to its own realm. Alex jumped to his feet. You're insane. We're not going to kill ourselves for some mystical bullshit. But even as he spoke, I felt that pull again. The same inexplicable force that had drawn us to this clearing. I looked at the altar, at the knife gleaming in the fading light, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that Daniel was telling the truth. Alex, I said softly. I think he's right. Alex stared at me in disbelief. Mal, no. You can't seriously be considering this. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky. Think about it, Alex. Everything that's happened, everything we've seen, it all led us here. And if we don't do something, that thing will keep growing stronger. How long before it breaks free completely? How many more people will suffer like Daniel has? For a long moment, Alex said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Okay, but I want you to know, Mal, that you're the best friend I've ever had. If this is how it ends, I'm glad I'm here with you. Tears stung my eyes as I pulled him into a hug. Me too, buddy. Me too. Daniel approached us, the ritual knife in his hands. Thank you, he said, his voice heavy with gratitude and sorrow. Your sacrifice will save countless lives. Are you ready? We nodded, too choked up to speak. Daniel began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, his voice rising and falling in an otherworldly cadence. The symbols on the ground began to glow, pulsing with an eerie light. As Daniel's chant reached a crescendo, the air itself seemed to split open. A rift appeared above the altar, a window into a realm of swirling chaos and impossible geometries. The entity we'd seen in the cabin began to emerge, its form shifting and writhing in ways that hurt to look at. Daniel handed me the knife, his eyes full of compassion. It must be you, he said. Your blood freely given will seal the breach. With shaking hands, I took the knife. I looked at Alex one last time, saw my own fear and determination mirrored in his eyes. Then, before I could lose my nerve, I plunged the knife into my chest. Pain exploded through me, but it was quickly replaced by a strange warmth. I felt my life force draining away, but instead of fear, I felt peace. I saw Alex fall beside me, his own sacrifice made. As my vision began to fade, I saw the rift above us start to close. The entity screamed, a sound of rage and frustration that shook the very foundations of reality. It was drawn back into the closing portal, its influence on our world finally broken. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Daniel's face, tears streaming down his cheeks as he mouthed a silent, "Thank you." And then, nothing. I gasped awake, my heart pounding. For a moment I didn't know where I was. Then slowly reality seeped back in. I was in my bedroom, in my apartment in the city. It was 2024, and I was 51 years old. It had all been a dream. A vivid, terrifying dream. But a dream nonetheless. Hadn't it? But as I sat there trying to shake off the lingering effects of the nightmare, doubt began to creep in. The details were too vivid, the emotions too raw. And there, on my chest, was a scar I didn't remember having before. A scar in the exact spot where I had plunged the ritual knife. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang once, twice, then. Hello? The voice on the other end was older, but unmistakably Alex's. Alex, I said, my voice cracking. I had a dream. About the forest. About the cabin. There was a long silence on the other end. Then softly Alex spoke. It wasn't a dream, Mal. Was it? I closed my eyes, a mix of relief and fear washing over me. No, I said. No, I don't think it was. We talked for hours, piecing together fragments of memories that had been buried for decades. Somehow, we had survived. Somehow, we had been given a second chance at life. But the price had been our memories, our understanding of what had really happened in those woods. As we talked, I found myself looking out my window at the city around me. It all seemed so normal, so mundane. But now I knew the truth. I knew that behind the veil of everyday reality, there were things beyond human comprehension. Terrible things, yes, but also wonders. Our sacrifice had sealed the breach. had saved who knows how many lives. But it had also opened our eyes to a larger universe, one filled with mystery and magic. As I hung up the phone, I made a decision. It was time to go back. Back to those woods, back to where it all began. Not to reopen old wounds, but to understand, to remember, and perhaps, just perhaps, to find a way to use our hard-won knowledge to help others, to be guardians against the darkness we now knew existed. After all, that's what second chances are for, right? I've always been the kind of guy who likes to take the road less traveled, both literally and figuratively. So, when I found myself with a week off from work in the summer of 1993, I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the vast expanse of Pinewood National Forest. I'm Marcus Holloway, by the way. I grew up in the bustling suburbs of Philadelphia, but my heart has always belonged to the wilderness. The forest, with its dense canopy and miles of untouched trails, was my sanctuary, a place where I could clear my mind and reset. This particular trip was different, though. I wasn't just out for a peaceful hike. I needed some time alone to think about the mess my personal life had become. My wife Elena and I had been going through a rough patch. We weren't seeing eye to eye on anything lately. Our once vibrant conversations had dwindled to terse exchanges about groceries and bills. The spark that had brought us together seemed to have fizzled out, leaving behind a cold, empty space between us. Sometimes I thought maybe getting away from it all would help me see things clearer, figure out what I wanted, what we needed. The forest had always been my go-to place for introspection, and I hoped it would work its magic once again. As I packed my gear into my old, reliable Jeep Cherokee, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. The thrill of adventure coursed through my veins, but there was also a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about this trip felt different, more significant somehow. I left a note for Elena, telling her where I was going and when I expected to be back. She was visiting her sister in Pittsburgh, so we wouldn't have a chance to talk before I left. Part of me was relieved. I wasn't sure what I would say to her anyway. The drive to Pinewood National Forest took about 4 hours. As the urban landscape gave way to rolling hills and eventually thick forests, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. The further I got from the city, the more I could breathe. I arrived at the ranger station just as the sun was beginning to set. The friendly ranger, a middle-aged man named Frank, greeted me with a warm smile. "Welcome to Pinewood, son," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Got your permit?" I handed over the necessary paperwork, which I had filled out online weeks ago. "Looks good," Frank nodded, stamping the form. "You planning on staying long?" "About a week," I replied. "Thought I'd do some exploring, maybe check out some of the less traveled trails." Frank's eyebrows raised slightly. "Well, you be careful out there. Some of those old trails can be tricky. Make sure you've got a good map and compass." I patted my backpack. "Got it all right here, don't worry, I've been hiking these woods for years." Frank nodded, but I could see a hint of concern in his eyes. "All right then, just make sure you check in when you get back. And if you run into any trouble, use this." He handed me a small satellite phone. "It's got my number programmed in. Don't hesitate to call if you need anything." I thanked him, tucked the phone into my pack, and headed out to find a spot to camp for the night. As I set up my tent in a small clearing near the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that Frank's concern was more than just standard ranger caution. But I pushed the thought aside. I was here to relax and clear my head, not to get caught up in unfounded worries. As night fell, I sat by my small campfire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The crackling of the flames mingled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The stars peeked through the canopy above, twinkling like distant beacons. I thought about Elena, wondering what she was doing right now. Was she thinking about me too? Did she even care that I was gone? Our last conversation replayed in my mind, the harsh words we'd exchanged echoing in the stillness of the night. "You're never here, Marcus," she had said, her voice tight with frustration. "Even when you're physically present, your mind is always somewhere else." "That's not fair," I had retorted. "I work hard to provide for us. I can't help it if my job is demanding." "It's not about the job," Elena had sighed. "It's about us. When was the last time we really talked? Really connected?" I hadn't had an answer for her then, and I didn't have one now. As I stared into the dying embers of my fire, I realized that this trip wasn't just about clearing my head. It was about finding a way to save my marriage, to reconnect with the man I used to be, the man Elena had fallen in love with. With these heavy thoughts swirling in my mind, I doused the fire and crawled into my tent. As I drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the forest seemed to whisper to me, promising answers hidden in its depths. Little did I know, the forest held secrets far beyond my imagination, secrets that would change my life forever. The next morning, I woke with the sun. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee, then packed up my gear. Today, I planned to head deeper into the forest, following one of the less-traveled trails. As I hiked, the forest came alive around me. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds called to each other from the treetops, and occasionally I'd spot a squirrel or chipmunk darting across my path. The trail I had chosen was narrow and overgrown in places, clearly not used much by other hikers. It wound its way through dense stands of pine and oak, occasionally opening up into small clearings filled with wildflowers. As I walked, my mind wandered back to Elena. We had met in college, both of us passionate about environmental science. We had grand plans to change the world, to protect places like this. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had gotten lost in the day-to-day grind of adult life. I had taken a job with a big corporation, telling myself it was just temporary, a way to pay off student loans and save some money. But years had passed, and I was still there, climbing the corporate ladder, spending more and more time at the office and less time doing the things I loved. Elena had stayed true to our original plans, working for a nonprofit dedicated to forest conservation. I knew she was disappointed in me, even if she never said it outright. She saw my job as a betrayal of our shared values. Lost in these thoughts, I almost missed the fork in the trail. It was barely noticeable, just a faint path leading off to the right. My map showed it as an old logging trail, long abandoned. On a whim, I decided to follow it. The path quickly became more challenging. Fallen trees blocked the way in several places, and I had to climb over or duck under them. The underbrush was thicker here, scratching at my legs as I pushed through. After about an hour of tough hiking, I emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of an old cabin. The roof had partially caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Curiosity piqued, I approached the cabin cautiously. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty and thick with dust. Broken furniture littered the floor, and a rusted old stove stood in one corner. As I was about to leave, something caught my eye. In the far corner, partially hidden under some debris, was an old leather-bound book. I carefully extracted it, brushing off years of dust and grime. It was a journal, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The name inside the cover read, Thomas Blackwood, 1952. My heart raced with excitement. This was a piece of history, a glimpse into the life of someone who had lived in these woods long ago. I sat down on a relatively stable-looking chair and began to read. Most of the entries were mundane accounts of daily life, descriptions of the weather, notes on hunting and trapping, occasional complaints about the isolation. But as I flipped through the pages, one entry stood out. May 15th, 1952. Something strange is happening in these woods. I've been hearing things at night, voices that don't belong to any animal I know. Yesterday I found tracks near the cabin. Too big to be human, but clearly not bear or elk. I'm starting to wonder if the old stories are true. God help me if they are. A chill ran down my spine as I read these words. What old stories was Thomas referring to? And what could have made tracks that frightened an experienced woodsman? I was so engrossed in the journal that I didn't notice how much time had passed. The light filtering through the broken windows had taken on the golden hue of late afternoon. I needed to set up camp soon. Tucking the journal into my backpack, I left the cabin and quickly set up my tent in the clearing. As I prepared my dinner over a small fire, I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas Blackwood's words. What had he experienced in these woods? As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. The friendly chirping of birds was replaced by the eerie hoots of owls and the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The trees cast long shadows in the flickering firelight, their branches seeming to reach out like grasping fingers. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just my imagination running wild after reading the old journal, but as I lay in my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified in the darkness. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and echoing voices, calling out from the depths of the forest. I woke the next morning feeling groggy and unrested. The events of the previous day, finding the cabin, reading Thomas Blackwood's journal, seemed almost dreamlike in the soft morning light. But the leather-bound book was still there in my backpack, a tangible reminder that it had all been real. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. Perhaps I could find some clues about Thomas Blackwood, or what might have happened to him. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles, making it difficult to spot any signs of past human activity. But as I circled wider around the cabin, I began to notice things. The stump of a tree that had been cut down long ago, now almost completely reclaimed by moss and fungi. A rusted axe head half buried in the soil. The faint outline of what might once have been a garden plot. About 100 yards from the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a stone about the size of a dinner plate partially buried in the ground. What caught my eye was the carving on its surface, a crude but unmistakable drawing of a humanoid figure. But this was no ordinary human. The figure was unnaturally tall and thin, with long, spindly arms that nearly reached the ground. Its head was oversized and oddly shaped, with large, hollow eyes. I brushed away the dirt and leaves covering the rest of the stone, revealing more carvings. There were strange symbols I didn't recognize, and below the figure, a date, 1897. This stone predated Thomas Blackwood by over 50 years. My mind raced. What did this mean? Was this connected to the old stories Thomas had mentioned in his journal? I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures of the stone, making sure to capture all the details of the carving. As I stood up, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. For a moment I thought I saw movement among the trees, a tall, dark shape sliding behind a trunk. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the forest. There was no response, just the usual sounds of birds and wind in the leaves. I hurried back to my campsite, my earlier curiosity replaced by a growing sense of unease. As I approached the clearing, I stopped short. Something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My tent was open. I was sure I had zipped it closed before leaving. Cautiously, I approached. Nothing seemed to be missing, but my sleeping bag and other gear had been moved around, as if someone, or something, had been searching through them. The journal was still in my backpack where I had left it, but it was now open to a specific page. The entry was dated June 3rd, 1952. I saw it last night. God help me, I saw it. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that hung down to the ground. Its face, I can't describe its face. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just watching. I don't know how long it was there. When I blinked, it was gone. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can stay here anymore. My hands shook as I read the words. They matched almost exactly with what I had seen carved on the stone. This couldn't be a coincidence. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every sound. As night fell, I debated whether to stay another night or pack up and leave. In the end, my curiosity won out over my fear. I had to know more about what was happening in these woods. That night I lay awake in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle, every snapping twig made me tense up. I must have dozed off at some point because I was jolted awake by a sound, a long, low whistle that didn't belong to any bird or animal I knew. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The whistle came again, closer this time. Then to my horror I heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps that no human could make. They circled my tent once, twice. I could see a shadow moving outside, impossibly tall and thin. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. There was a moment of terrible silence and then a voice that sounded like the creaking of old trees and the whisper of wind through leaves, spoke a single word. Soon. I must have passed out from sheer terror because the next thing I knew it was morning. The birds were singing as if nothing had happened. But when I unzipped my tent with trembling hands, I saw something that proved it hadn't been a dream. There, in the soft earth in front of my tent, was a single footprint. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and strangely shaped. And leading away from it, into the depths of the forest, was a trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves. I knew then that I had stumbled into something far beyond my understanding. The forest had secrets, dark and ancient secrets, and somehow I had become entangled in them. As I stood there, staring at that impossible footprint, I realized that my simple hiking trip had turned into something much more dangerous and much more important. I couldn't leave now. I had to find out what was happening in Pinewood National Forest, for Thomas Blackwood, for myself, and for anyone else who might stumble into these woods unprepared. I had to uncover the truth. Little did I know, the truth would be more terrifying and more transformative than I could ever have imagined. With shaking hands, I packed up my camp. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I had to know more. I decided to follow the trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves. It led deeper into the forest, away from any marked trails. As I walked, the trees seemed to grow taller and closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler and damper, filled with the earthy scent of decay. After about an hour of careful tracking, I came to a small stream. The water burbled over moss-covered rocks, creating a soothing white noise that momentarily calmed my frayed nerves. But as I knelt to refill my water bottle, I noticed something odd. The rocks in the stream bed were arranged in a distinct pattern, a spiral that was too perfect to be natural. At the center of the spiral was a smooth black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. Curiosity overcame caution, and I reached into the cold water to pick up the stone. As soon as my fingers touched its surface, a jolt of energy surged through my body. Visions flashed before my eyes, ancient trees, shadowy figures, a moonlit clearing filled with standing stones. When the visions faded, I found myself on my knees, gasping for breath. The black stone felt warm in my hand now, pulsing with a faint energy. I knew I should probably leave it behind, but something compelled me to slip it into my pocket. As I stood up, I noticed that the trail I'd been following was now clearly visible, as if highlighted by an unseen force. With a mix of fear and determination, I pressed on. The trail led me to a series of increasingly strange discoveries. I found trees with symbols carved into their bark, similar to those I had seen on the stone near the cabin. In a small clearing, I discovered a circle of mushrooms that seemed to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. As the day wore on, the forest around me began to change subtly. The plants became unfamiliar with strange, twisted shapes and colors that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew thick and hazy, and I began to hear whispers at the edge of my perception, too faint to make out words but undeniably present. Just as the last of the daylight was fading, I emerged into a large clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, each easily twice my height. They were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and move in the twilight. At the center of the circle was a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I hoped wasn't blood. As I approached the circle, the whispers grew louder. I could almost understand them now, almost grasp the meaning behind their urgent, insistent tone. The black stone in my pocket grew hot, almost burning against my leg. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. I spun around and found myself face to face with an old man. He was tall and lean, with a wild beard and eyes that seemed to glow in the gathering darkness. He wore clothes that looked like they were made from bark and leaves, perfectly blending in with the forest around us. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "These woods aren't safe for your kind anymore." "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my heart pounding. "What's happening here?" The old man sighed, looking suddenly weary. "My name is Ezra. I was once like you, a visitor to these woods. But that was a long time ago. Now I'm the caretaker, the watcher. I try to keep people away, to keep them safe." "Safe from what?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Ezra's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "From them, the old ones, the spirits of the forest that were here long before us, and will be here long after we're gone." As if summoned by his words, a cold wind swept through the clearing. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and the carvings on the standing stones began to glow with an eerie green light. "They're coming," Ezra said, grabbing my arm. "We need to go, now." But it was too late. As we turned to run, I saw them emerging from the trees, tall, impossibly thin figures with long, spindly arms and oversized heads. Their eyes were hollow and dark, but seemed to glow with an inner light. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. Ezra pulled me behind one of the standing stones. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "They're drawn to fear. You must control your emotions. Think of something that makes you feel strong, feel loved." I closed my eyes, trying to focus. I thought of Elena, of the love we once shared, of the future we had dreamed of together. I thought of the peace I had always found in nature, the connection I felt to the world around me. When I opened my eyes, the clearing had changed. The old ones were still there, but they seemed less menacing now. They moved around us, curious, but not threatening. One of them approached, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the black stone. It was glowing now, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The old one reached out one long, slender finger and touched the stone. In that moment, understanding flooded through me. I saw the history of the forest, the ancient pact between humans and the spirits of the land. I saw how that pact had been broken, how the old ones had been pushed back, contained, forgotten. They weren't evil, I realized. They were guardians, protectors of the natural world. But they had been twisted by fear and misunderstanding, turned into monsters by human ignorance. As the visions faded, I found myself standing in the center of the stone circle. The old ones were gathered around me, waiting. I knew what I had to do. I placed the black stone on the altar. As soon as it touched the surface, it began to sink into the stone as if merging with it. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and a pulse of energy radiated outward from the altar. The old ones began to change. Their forms became less menacing, more natural. They merged with the trees, the rocks, the very air around us. In moments, they were gone, but not really gone. I could feel their presence all around us, a benevolent force watching over the forest. Ezra approached me, his eyes wide with wonder. "You've done it," he said softly. "You've restored the balance. The old ones are at peace." As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I felt a profound sense of change, both in the forest and in myself. I knew I couldn't go back to my old life, not after what I had experienced. I spent the next few weeks with Ezra, learning the old ways, understanding the true nature of the forest and its guardians. When I finally emerged from the woods, I was a changed man. I went back to Philadelphia, back to Elena. I told her everything, fully expecting her to think I had lost my mind. But she listened, and she understood. She had always been more in tune with the natural world than I had. Together we made a decision. We left our old lives behind and moved to a small town on the edge of Pinewood National Forest. Elena took a job with the Park Service, and I became a guide, leading carefully selected groups into the woods, teaching them about the true nature of the forest and its guardians. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we can hear the whispers of the old ones in the rustling of leaves. And sometimes, out of the corner of our eyes, we catch glimpses of tall, slender figures moving among the trees. But we're not afraid anymore. We understand now. We're part of the forest, and the forest is part of us. As for Thomas Blackwood's journal, I keep it safe. Someday, when the time is right, I'll pass it on to someone else who needs to learn the truth about Pinewood National Forest. Because the forest has its secrets, and sometimes those secrets choose their keepers. My name is Frank Wilson. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in 1990, when I was a young man of 40 living in a small town called Evergreen Falls, nestled in the heart of Oregon's dense forests. Evergreen Falls wasn't much to look at, just a handful of streets, a grocery store, a bar, and the ever-present aroma of pine sap hanging in the air. I worked as a mechanic at the only auto shop in town, a place called Evergreen Motors. I had a simple life back then, fixing cars during the week, fishing on weekends, and sharing beers with friends at the local watering hole, the Rusty Nail. It was an honest living, surrounded by people I knew and trusted. I loved that life, with its predictable rhythms and familiar faces. Little did I know that everything was about to change. It all started on a crisp autumn evening in late September. I had just finished a long day at the shop, my hands greasy and my back aching from bending over engines all day. As I locked up Evergreen Motors, I was looking forward to a quiet night at home, maybe watching some TV or reading a book. As I stepped out onto the street, I noticed that the sky was unusually dark. Thick, ominous clouds rolled in from the west, and a chilly wind started to pick up, rustling the pine trees that bordered our little town. The leaves on the maple trees lining Main Street had already started to turn, their vibrant reds and golds a stark contrast to the darkening sky. I pulled my worn denim jacket tighter around me and headed home, the wind nipping at my heels. My house was a small one-bedroom place on the edge of town, right where the neatly kept lawns gave way to the wild forest beyond. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. I always made sure to lock up before leaving. It was a habit ingrained in me since childhood. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. Pushing the door open slowly, I stepped inside. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the porch light filtering through the open door. "Hello? Anybody here?" I called out, my voice sounding uncertain in the empty space. No response. I flicked on the living room light, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The worn but comfortable couch was still in its place, the stack of car magazines on the coffee table undisturbed. No signs of a break-in. I checked the windows and back door, all locked. Maybe I had just forgotten to close the door properly in my rush to get to work that morning. I laughed it off, calling myself paranoid, and went about my evening routine. I had just settled down on the couch with a cold beer and a rerun of some old sitcom when I heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from the back of the house. My ears perked up, and I muted the TV. There it was again, like something scraping against wooden siding. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to investigate, my curiosity overriding my apprehension. As I stepped out onto the back porch, The wind had picked up even more, howling through the trees and making the hairs on my neck stand up. I swept the flashlight beam across the yard, seeing nothing but the usual: an old shed, my rusted pickup truck, and the dense forest beyond. I was about to head back inside when I saw it. Movement in the shadows near the tree line. It was quick, a flash of something pale and humanoid, but not quite right. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, but whatever it was had disappeared into the woods. Probably just a trick of the light, I told myself, though my voice shook as I spoke the words aloud. I went back inside, double-checked all the locks, and tried to relax. But sleep didn't come easy that night. My mind kept replaying that fleeting glimpse of the strange figure, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friend Kenny at the shop. Kenny was a big guy with a loud laugh, always ready with a joke or a story. He listened with a skeptical smile as I recounted the events of the previous night. "Probably just a deer or something, Frank," he said, slapping me on the back. "You need to get out more, man. Come fishing with me this weekend, clear your head." I agreed, hoping that maybe Kenny was right. But the unease stayed with me, a constant presence at the back of my mind as I went about my work. The rest of the week passed uneventfully, though I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the woods. On Friday night, after a few beers with Kenny and some of the guys at the Rusty Nail, I felt a little more at ease. Maybe I had been overreacting. But that night, it happened again. The scratching noise woke me up around midnight. This time it was louder, more insistent. I got up, flashlight in hand, and crept to the back door. As I stepped outside, the wind hit me like a slap to the face, cold and relentless. I moved the beam of light across the yard, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the forest was the figure. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally pale. Its limbs were long and gangly, almost spider-like. It stood there, motionless, watching me with dark, hollow eyes. Fear shot through me like a bolt of lightning. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. The creature took a step forward, and I finally found my voice. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. It didn't respond, just kept moving toward me with a slow, deliberate gait. I backed up into the house and slammed the door shut, locking it. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I grabbed the phone and called Kenny. "Kenny, you need to get over here now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something outside my house." "What are you talking about?" he asked, sounding groggy. "Just get here, please." 15 minutes later, Kenny showed up, shotgun in hand. I let him in, and we both peered out the window. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. "I don't see anything," Kenny said, but he didn't sound convinced. "I know what I saw, Kenny. It was right there." He sighed and nodded. "We'll keep watch, see if it comes back." We stayed up, taking turns watching the yard, but nothing happened. By morning, Kenny was convinced I had just imagined it, but I knew better. Something was out there, and it wasn't going away. Over the next few days, I did my best to carry on with life, but I couldn't shake the fear. I started keeping the shotgun close, locking all the doors and windows and avoiding going out after dark. I even talked to some of the older folks in town, asking if they'd ever seen anything strange in the woods. Most of them just shrugged it off, but Old Man Tate, who had lived in Evergreen Falls his whole life, gave me a knowing look. "You've seen the Wendigo," he said quietly, glancing around as if the very mention of the name could summon it. "The Wendigo?" I asked, confused. "A creature from old native legends," he explained. "A spirit of the forest, cursed to wander, always hungry for human flesh." I thought it was just a story, but maybe there's some truth to it. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever I had seen, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to stop. The next incident was far worse. A couple of nights later, I was woken up again by the scratching noise, only this time, it was at the front door. I grabbed the shotgun and slowly approached. As I reached for the doorknob, the door burst open and the creature lunged at me. Its long, bony fingers wrapped around my neck and its hollow eyes bored into mine. I struggled, kicking and punching, trying to break free. The shotgun was useless in such close quarters. Just as I felt myself losing consciousness, Kenny burst through the back door, firing his shotgun. The creature let out a horrible shriek and released me, retreating into the shadows. "Frank, you okay?" Kenny shouted, helping me up. I coughed and nodded, my throat burning. "Yeah, I think so. Thanks, man. You saved my life." "We need to get out of here," he said, looking around nervously. "This thing isn't going to stop." We grabbed what we could and left the house, heading for Kenny's place on the other side of town. As we drove, I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting the creature to be following us. The next few days were a blur. I stayed with Kenny, and we tried to come up with a plan. The creature was still out there, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. We needed to figure out a way to get rid of it, once and for all. Old Man Tate's words kept echoing in my mind. The Wendigo, a cursed spirit, always hungry. I did some research, reading everything I could find about the legend. Most of it was just stories, but there was one detail that stood out. A Wendigo could be killed by fire. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Kenny and I gathered what we needed: gasoline, matches, and our shotguns. We decided to set a trap at my house, hoping to lure the creature in and burn it. It was risky, but we were desperate. That night, we set everything up, dousing the yard and the front porch with gasoline. We hid inside, watching and waiting. Sure enough, around midnight, the scratching started. This time, it was at the back door. "Ready?" Kenny whispered, his grip tight on the shotgun. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, let's do this." We stepped out onto the back porch, and there it was, standing just at the edge of the yard. It seemed almost hesitant, as if it knew we were up to something. Kenny fired a warning shot, and the creature snarled, baring its teeth. "Come on, you ugly bastard," I shouted, trying to draw it closer. The creature lunged forward, and Kenny and I lit the gasoline. Flames roared to life, spreading quickly across the yard. The creature shrieked and tried to retreat, but it was too late. The fire consumed it, its pale skin blackening and curling. The smell was horrific, but I couldn't look away. After what felt like an eternity, the creature collapsed, its body reduced to ash and charred bones. We stood there, watching the flames die down, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. Is it really dead?" Kenny asked, his voice shaky. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure. "I hope so." The next few days were tense, but there were no more sightings, no more scratching noises. The town slowly returned to normal, and so did I, though the fear never completely left me. I moved back into my house, but I kept the shotgun close and the doors locked tight. Kenny and I never talked much about what happened, but we both knew we'd been through something unbelievable. Old Man Tate was the only one who seemed to understand, giving me a knowing nod whenever we crossed paths. Life went on, and Evergreen Falls remained the quiet, unassuming town it had always been. But every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something in the woods, something that made my heart race and my blood run cold. I tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. The Wendigo might be gone, but its legend lived on, a reminder that some things are best left undisturbed. And though I tried to move on, a part of me would always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next encounter with the unknown. As I sit here now, an old man of 74, I can't help but wonder if it was all real. Did I really face a creature of legend? Or was it just the overactive imagination of a lonely man in a small town? But then I look at the scars on my neck, feel the lingering fear that never quite goes away, and I know. The forests of Evergreen Falls hold secrets, and some of them are better left in the shadows. But for those who have seen beyond the veil, life is never quite the same. We carry the weight of that knowledge, a burden and a responsibility. And as I look out my window at the encroaching darkness of the forest, I can't help but wonder, are there more creatures out there, waiting in the shadows? And who will be there to face them when they emerge? The wind whispers through the pines, and for a moment, I swear I hear the faint echo of that unearthly shriek. I close my curtains, check my locks, and settle in for another long night. In Evergreen Falls, you never know what the darkness might bring. The call came in just as I was about to clock out for the day. It was late autumn, and the sun was already sinking behind the jagged peaks of the Cascade Mountains. I remember the way the fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful sight that belied the grim news I was about to receive. "Jensen," my boss, Chief Ranger Marlowe, barked as he strode into the room. "We've got a situation. Kid's gone missing up in Evergreen Falls." I suppressed a sigh, my hand hovering over my jacket. So much for getting home in time for dinner. "What's the story?" I asked, already reaching for my gear. Marlowe's weathered face was creased with concern. "Parents are out-of-towners, weekend campers. Let their boy wander off. Said he was obsessed with some old Forest Service cabin deep in the woods." I nodded, a familiar weight settling in my gut. It was always the same with these types. City folk who thought the wilderness was just a big playground. They never respected the forest, never understood its dangers. "Kid's name is Alex," Marlowe continued, handing me a photograph. 8 years old, been missing for about 3 hours now. I studied the picture. The boy was skinny, with ears that stuck out a bit too far and a bowl cut that looked like it had been done at home. Nothing special, just an ordinary kid. And that's what worried me most. In my 15 years with search and rescue, I'd learned that it was often the unremarkable ones who met the worst fates. "I'll grab Erickson and Rodriguez," I said, already mentally preparing for a long night ahead. "We'll head out immediately." Marlowe nodded grimly. "Good. Keep me posted, Jensen, and be careful out there. Something about this doesn't feel right." I knew exactly what he meant. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to whisper of impending danger. But that was the job, walking into the unknown, facing whatever the forest threw at us. My name's Daniel Jensen, search and rescue for the U.S. Forest Service. I've seen it all over the years: lost hikers, injured climbers, the occasional animal attack. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter in Evergreen Falls. As we drove up to the campsite, the last remnants of daylight were fading fast. The forest loomed around us, ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars stretching towards the darkening sky. There's something about old-growth forests that always puts me on edge. Maybe it's the shadows that seem to move when you're not looking, or the way sound gets swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. Whatever it is, it makes you feel small, insignificant. A reminder that we're just visitors in a world that's far older and wilder than we like to admit. The boy's parents were waiting for us at the trailhead. The mother, a petite woman with red-rimmed eyes, was clutching a stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that I assumed belonged to Alex. The father stood a little apart, his face a mask of forced calm. I've seen that look before, the desperate attempt to appear in control when your world is falling apart. "Mr. and Mrs. Carpenter?" I approached them, my voice steady and professional. "I'm Ranger Jensen. This is Ranger Erickson and Ranger Rodriguez. We're here to find your son." Mrs. Carpenter let out a choked sob at my words, while Mr. Carpenter stepped forward, his hand extended. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, his voice strained. We don't know what happened. Alex was right here, and then..." I nodded, cutting him off gently. We didn't have time for a detailed recounting. Every minute counted in a search like this. "Can you tell me exactly when you last saw Alex and in which direction he was heading?" As Mr. Carpenter filled us in on the details, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the tree line. my hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung over my shoulder. There was nothing there, just the encroaching darkness and the whisper of wind through the trees. But the feeling persisted, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. "All right," I said, turning to my team. "We'll start with a grid search of the immediate area. Erickson, you take the north quadrant. Rodriguez, you go east. I'll head west. We'll meet back here in an hour to regroup and plan our next move." As we prepared to head out, Mrs. Carpenter grabbed my arm. Her eyes were wild with fear and desperation. "Please," she whispered. "Please find our boy. He's all we have." I met her gaze, seeing the raw pain there. It's moments like these that make this job both rewarding and heartbreaking. "We'll do everything we can, ma'am," I promised. "Your son is our top priority." With that, we set off into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming ever larger as night fell. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a knife, as I moved deeper into the woods, calling out Alex's name at regular intervals. That feeling of being watched intensified. I've spent most of my life in these forests. I know their sounds, their rhythms. But that night, everything felt off. The usual nighttime chorus of insects and nocturnal animals was strangely muted. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as if the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. An hour passed, then two. We regrouped, shared what little information we had, which was nothing, and headed out again. By midnight, we had covered a significant area around the campsite, but there was still no sign of Alex. No footprints, no scraps of clothing caught on branches. Nothing. It was nearing 2 a.m. when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crunch of leaves under my boots. But as I stood still, straining my ears, it came again. A high-pitched, keening noise, almost like a child's cry, but wrong somehow. Distorted. Unnatural. My heart began to race as I radioed my position to the others. "I've got something," I said, my voice low and urgent. "About half a mile west of the campsite, some kind of sound. I'm going to investigate." "Be careful, Jensen," Erickson's voice crackled over the radio. "We're on our way to your position." I moved forward cautiously, my rifle now in my hands. The sound came again, louder this time, and I could pinpoint its direction. It was coming from a small clearing up ahead, where the trees thinned out a bit. As I approached the edge of the clearing, the moonlight broke through the canopy, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall, maybe 6.5 feet. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized with growing horror that whatever this was, it wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, hanging almost to the ground. The legs were bent at odd angles like a spider's. And the skin, God, the skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, with a sickly sheen that made my stomach churn. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. As the creature turned towards me, I saw that its features were a grotesque parody of humanity. The eyes were huge, black orbs that reflected the moonlight like polished obsidian. The nose was little more than 2 slits above a mouth that was far too wide, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. For a moment we just stared at each other, the ranger and the monster. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, its mouth opened impossibly wide, and it let out that keening cry I had heard before. Only now, up close, I realized it wasn't a cry at all. It was laughter. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. "Don't move," I shouted, my voice sounding thin and weak in the face of this abomination. The creature cocked its head to one side, regarding me with what seemed like curiosity. Then, with a speed that defied its awkward appearance, it charged. I fired, the sound of the shot deafening in the quiet forest. The creature staggered, dark ichor sprang from a wound in its chest, but it didn't go down. Instead, it let out a shriek of rage and pain that sent birds exploding from the trees in panic. I fired again and again, emptying my magazine into the advancing monster. It jerked and twitched with each impact, but it kept coming, its long arms reaching for me, claws gleaming in the moonlight. Just as I thought it was all over, that this thing was going to tear me apart, I heard shouting and the sound of running feet. Erickson and Rodriguez burst into the clearing, their own weapons raised. The creature turned at the new threat, giving me just enough time to reload. We opened fire together, the combined firepower finally bringing the monster down. It thrashed on the ground, making horrible gurgling noises before finally going still. For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, guns trained on the creature's motionless form, our breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell is that thing? Rodriguez whispered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to form words. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like this, never even imagined something like this could exist. As the adrenaline began to fade, I remembered why we were out here in the first place. Alex, I said, my eyes scanning the clearing. We need to find Alex. We spread out, searching the area around the clearing. That's when I saw it. A small sneaker, half hidden under a bush. My heart sank as I approached, fearing what I might find. But there was no body, no sign of violence, just the shoe, and next to it, a small backpack. I called the others over and we examined the items closely. The backpack contained a few snacks, a water bottle, and a small notebook. I flipped through the notebook, my flashlight illuminating childish drawings. Most were typical kid stuff, superheroes, animals, his family. But the last few pages were different. They showed crude but unsettling sketches of a tall, spindly figure standing among trees. And on the very last page, in large, shaky letters, "It's calling me." A chill ran down my spine as I looked from the notebook to the dead creature lying just a few yards away. What had happened here? What had this thing done to Alex? We searched through the night and into the next day, but we never found Alex. The creature's body, to our shock and confusion, had disappeared by morning, leaving behind only a large, dark stain on the forest floor. The official report cited an animal attack, possibly a bear, though no one who had seen the creature believed that for a second. Alex was listed as missing, presumed dead. His parents were devastated, of course. They moved away soon after, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. As for me, I couldn't look at the forest the same way after that night. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every unexplained sound set my nerves on edge. I tried to continue with my job, but after a few months of jumping at every rustle in the undergrowth, I knew it was time to leave. I put in for a transfer, ended up taking a desk job at park headquarters. It was safer, saner, but I couldn't shake the memories of that night. Couldn't forget the sight of that thing charging towards me, or the sound of its unnatural laughter echoing through the trees. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself wondering, was that creature unique? A solitary aberration in an otherwise normal world? Or are there more of them out there, hiding in the deep woods, waiting for unwary hikers to stray too far from the trail? And what about Alex? Did he die that night, another victim of the forest's hidden dangers? Or did something worse happen to him? Sometimes in my darkest moments, I imagine him out there still, changed, transformed into something other. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I fought, and I know that the wilderness we think we've tamed is still wild, still dangerous, and still holds secrets that we can't even begin to understand. So if you're ever out in the woods and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, or see a shadow move in a way that shadows shouldn't, don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because there are things out there in the dark things that shouldn't exist. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. As for me, I've left the forest behind. But sometimes, I wonder if the forest has truly left me. In my dreams, I still hear that keening laughter, still see those black, soulless eyes, and I wake up wondering if, one day, the creature, or others like it, will come looking for me to finish what was started in that moonlit clearing. Until then, I'll keep telling myself it was just a bizarre, terrifying anomaly, a nightmare given flesh for one impossible night. Because the alternative, that there's a whole hidden world of such horrors lurking just beyond the veil of our everyday reality, is too much to bear. But deep down, in the part of me that will always be that terrified ranger in the clearing, I know the truth. The woods are vast and dark and full of secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth.